Welcome to the Details Podcast, where we deep dive into the world of car culture, history, and the passion that drives it all. I'm your host, Dan Williams, and today I have a special guest and a special show for you. Mike Lashmett, the owner of Vintage Indy, a man who's not only kept the legacy of Indy cars alive, but has also been a part of Indianapolis 500 championship teams himself. Mike's story is one of passion and dedication to preserving the rich history of open-wheel racing. We're going to hear about his journey, stories along the way, and I'm telling you, epic stories along the way, a near-death experience, his time in the racing world, and how Vintage Indy continues to honor one of America's greatest motorsport traditions. Stay tuned because this is a story you're not going to want to miss. And make sure you hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss anything else we're doing in the future, because we got a lot of fire coming your way. Let's go. Welcome to the Details Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Williams, Dan E. Williams, and today I have a special guest, somebody who I've met in Indianapolis, somebody who's an iconic person from the racing world, and plays a big part in keeping its legacy alive and going, Mr. Mike Lashmett. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great, Dan. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So we've met a couple times before when I was in Indianapolis at Ray Gilman Museum when I was there to interview Jim McGee. And also I interviewed Al Unser Jr. at your shop. All right. Well, let's take a little dive into your career and your life and how you got to where you are, because it's kind of a neat journey. Can you tell me a little bit about how you very first got into racing and maybe your first racing experience?
Well, I grew up over in a little west central Illinois farm town called Pittsfield. It's about 65 miles west and a hair south of Springfield, the state capital. We had a high bank quarter-mile dirt track that they ran a weekly super modified sprint car program on, and the USAC midgets would come through there a couple of times each summer. And so when I was very young, 5 or 6, my mom's youngest sister, my Aunt Bonnie, started dating this fellow, John Petty, and who eventually she married in 1960. And he built cars and raced, and when they were dating, they started taking me to races with them when I was about probably not quite 6 years old. So that was my first exposure to it all. My Uncle John knew a lot of people that were connected locally in that part of the state of Illinois with super modifieds primarily, and he built cars for Jerry Blundy. Jerry Blundy's a Sprint Car Hall of Fame member, driver, and it was an exciting thing for a 6-year-old kid to experience, and I was instantly hooked. And I took the route most American kids do: model cars, slot cars, and I think I started racing go-karts when I was 14 or 15. Pittsfield, where I grew up, was near Quincy, Illinois, which was really a hotbed for, go-kart racing in the 60s. TNT Kartways was there, and they hosted the IKF Nationals a number of times. And so I started racing at Quincy and Springfield and St. Louis and what was then called the ILMO circuit. I did that all through my teen years. And I ran the famous Quincy Park race in Quincy, Illinois, in its inaugural year of 1970. I raced there quite a few times, all the way up until 2001 when I quit racing karts. But that was kind of my background, during as far as my youth was concerned, was being around all these different forms of motorsports that were local, and then going to Indianapolis and right out of high school as an 18-year-old in 71. And
well, just a second. Let's ease into this instead of we're not in a race at this moment. let's save it and take a little time. So let's go back to that first time that you went to a race. You're 6 years old, and it sounds like you maybe you didn't just go up and sit in the grandstands per se. So maybe did you get to like go and look at the pits and see a little bit more of the kind of the magic and the stuff that really draws people in?
During those weeks back in the summertime and spring, my Uncle John would take me with him to his shop. And so I met a lot of these different race car people, and I watched these cars getting built, and I watched this one super modified that Jerry Blundy would go on to win 34 features with being built at that time. And, when I went to the racetrack, I'd usually sit in the grandstand with my aunt, and we'd watch my uncle race and all these other people that, were in that circle of friends and they weren't professional drivers, but they raced all over the place back then. So, and then after the races, they'd open the pit gate on the main straightaway, and we'd go down and, be around the cars and all these exotic smells, and the motors were hot, and don't touch the exhaust pipe, and, maybe get to sit in a car or two. And, it was really exciting for a kid of 6 years old.
Yeah. And I think that's really neat. A lot of the guys that are racers that I interview, they like to give back and really treat the children who are coming in and seeing it, really special to make it a great memory
Right.
for them.
Well, I mean, obviously, it left an impression on me. Something else that I really remember is those cars coming off the fourth corner, at these different tracks we'd go to, and these guys were just throwing rooster tails of dirt. I mean, just unbelievable, and the noise, and it was really exciting, for a person my age at that time. I was immediately hooked. I mean, it was what I was all about from then on. Period.
and which ones are the super modified cars? Is that like a sprint?
Well, super modifieds, they kind of look like a sprint car. They don't have a sprint car tail. The tail's maybe more squared off or different. And they were running full cages on those cars back then. Super modifieds had a cage. That was kind of the difference. And usually there'd be a piece of sheet metal or roof on them, or, a small piece of sheet metal. And that was the difference primarily between them and a sprint car. Wheelbase was pretty much the same. Most people were running, small block Chevys and, quick change rear ends, and all the componentry was kind of the same. The bodywork just looked a little different. A lot of super modifieds were uh, later on, people, got the desire to run sprint cars. They'd convert their super modified into a sprint car. They'd put a sprint car tail on it and the bodywork and the different componentry that you needed. But they used to mix those classes up at these short tracks in the Midwest. They'd run sprint cars with super modifieds. This isn't USAC per se, but in these local programs, and they'd have really, very stout fields of cars. They'd have a lot of cars. So
Yeah.
there were a
And
lot of racetracks in the, in that area in the Midwest. I mean, you could race a number of different nights per week. There was Jacksonville, Springfield, Pittsfield, Memphis, Missouri, Lincoln, Illinois, and then down around St. Louis, there was quite a few tracks down there, both paved in dirt. And this is all within like 100-mile radius of where I grew up. So
now, would you go to other kind of races too, or did at these tracks did they have like your stock car races that did the figure eights and like,
I mean, eventually a lot of those tracks, I don't know, it was kind of funny. And by the late 60s, stock car racing kind of became a big thing, and they introduced classes of stock cars at all these, short dirt tracks and modified stock cars and things like that. And they didn't run the cars mixed together. I mean, they'd have super modifieds and sprint cars there, then they'd have a stock car class. And eventually, at a lot of those tracks, the stock car classes took over. Don't ask me why, but by the time you got around 1970, 71, there was a lot of hype around NASCAR. Even back then, Talladega had been built and opened, and it just, I don't know, it took off in that part of the Midwest.
yeah. We grew up going to the races, those kind of we called them the redneck races, those little like tracks out there, and you'd have
Right.
lots of good fights in the pits. And it was a great way
Well,
as a kid to spend a weekend night though.
absolutely. I mean, in the early 60s, when USAC would come through my hometown with their USAC midgets, it was like a who's who of the Indy 500. Parnelli Jones, Roger Ward, AJ Foyt, McElreath. I mean, everybody and anybody that was in the Indy 500 was mixed in with, people that were just running the USAC midgets. And that was always exciting. The first place I ever saw Parnelli race was at my hometown track, and he won the feature that night and set fast time. Interestingly enough, he drove the leader card midget for the Wilkies out of Wisconsin that night, and that fast time stood for, I think, until the track was torn down. No one ever beat that fast time in that midget, even in a sprint car. I mean, it stood for a long, long time. And they'd had huge fields of cars back then. So it's really pretty exciting. I mean, I saw the Indy 500 drivers locally before I ever saw them at Indianapolis. So.
Yeah. So okay. So now you see the racing, you're obsessed with it, focused on open wheel. That's kind of what sounds like was really your jam.
Yeah, that was my jam. Open wheel with a focus on Indy. It's like this is how you get to Indy: sprint car, midget sprint cars, champ dirt cars, Indianapolis championship rear engine cars. That was what I was all about. And then Springfield was only 65 miles away, so USAC ran there every year during the state fair. They ran the champ dirt cars on the Springfield Mile, which is a famous track, and that field was made up of nothing but pretty much Indy 500 drivers. And to go there, in August of each year and go to that race and, get down in the pit area after the race was over and, you know, see Mario or see AJ or any of these other people that I was really a big fan of as a teenager. It was a really big deal.
And the guys now, they kind of come up through carts and 1600 and 2000, etc. But there's not so much of the crossover between racing sprint as well as IndyCar anymore. When did that kind of fade away?
Well, that started to fade away in the early 70s. It probably really started in the 60s with the advent of rear engine Indy cars, but nonetheless, uh, the way to Indy was still with USAC primarily through sprint cars midgets up until the early 70s. And in 1970, that was the last year that the USAC National Driving Championship included the dirt tracks like DeCoin, Hoosier 100, here in Indianapolis, out at the Indiana State Fairgrounds, Springfield, Sacramento, and so forth. And then they separated the dirt from the pavement the next year. They created what was a Gold Crown division, which was all the rear engine races on pavement, obviously. And then all the dirt races were called the Silver Crown division. It's still called the Silver Crown division. But I think that played a big part in changing the path. And then, you know, rear engine Indy cars had independent suspension, a different type of car. And, it required experience coming from almost another area, from a rear engine Formula type car, Formula Ford, Formula Atlantic, something like that. By the late 70s, USAC had created the Mini Indy series as a feeder, as a training ground to get to Indy cars. Mini Indy eventually became Indy Lights, and today we know it as Indy Next by Firestone. So that's how that change all happened. And in that change happening, it it totally changed, or in some people's minds destroyed, the path to Indianapolis for midget and sprint car drivers. Not for everybody, but for most people. And that's the way that previously everybody got to Indy, was through midgets and sprint cars. But that's certainly not the case now, and it hasn't been for probably the better part of 40 years.
No. How about your first Indy 500? Was that listening to it on the radio or was
Oh, Memorial Day growing up in Pittsfield was a big deal. They had a parade from, the courthouse square out to the West Cemetery, and, service group, the American Legion, shot, over the graves out there, and there was a ceremony and whatnot. And we would always go to that. Everybody in town did. And then uh, they'd have a barbecue, a chicken barbecue, one of the service groups, I think it was the American Legion also. And we'd have the Indy 500 on the car radio. We'd go up and, get this barbecue chicken and go home, and everybody would just kind of hang out and listen to the Indy 500. That's my first experience. Uh, you know, Probably 1960, 61, something like that. Little did I know that 10 years later I'd be with a 500 winning team, and everything that I heard on the radio would be happening in front of my very eyes. So,
right? You just didn't even see it coming. So
Only in America.
yeah. So you started racing yourself in karts. Tell me a little bit about how, like, after watching this and like obviously knowing, because I was a little boy once myself, how that drive and that to be the guy behind the wheel, at that point was just probably gnawing at you, gnawing you. Maybe you drive your parents crazy. You
Well,
don't even know.
I went from slot cars to go-karts in 67 and bought my first cart, and it was a used cart, and had to figure everything out, put it together, get it running. I did. My uncle provided a lot of help and advice, and he's the one that took me to the races. And I ran two or three races with that cart, and pretty quickly realized it wasn't competitive. So got a second used cart, a little bit better one, ran it a few races, and realized that this wasn't going to work either. And then I finally got my hands on a Mickey Rupp built dart cart, a Grand Prix model, and that's when I won my first race. And so we were off and running. And then in '68, I was able to trade that in at TNT up in Quincy, Illinois, with Gus Trader, who's an iconic figure in karting. And he set me up with a brand new Margay Newbury chassis with a Safari quick change gearbox, and I was off and running with that thing for quite a few years.
All right. First
But,
win of the
but
race.
learning curve like everything else, until you get some really good equipment and you know that stuff's not going to break and you're able to run up front. And I was really in deep water when I went kart racing because Terry Trader, Gus's son, I raced with him and some really other notable people in karting, and then later on people that went on to Formula One and Indy. And uh, I think that's what my ability was. And I could put stuff together and it wouldn't fall apart, it wouldn't break. And that was a big part of karting back then. Is was just to keep it running. And in order to finish first you got to finish. And I was a big believer in that. And I was really good at putting things together and making sure that they didn't come apart.
Okay. But let's just touch on that first win. Tell me about that win and how it felt to be up there on the.
Well, it was actually on dirt, and it was at Pittsfield Speedway. They had a kart race there one night during the regular, sprint car super modified late model program. This was in 1968, and I went out and got a set of Goodyear, Goodyear made kart tires back then. We got a new set of Goodyears, and a buddy of mine chalked them out, and we grooved them with a tire groover, and I went out and won the race and got a $25 check and a trophy. And I thought, I was on Broadway.
That's
So
so cool.
I mean, I could say this in jest, but Parnelli and I both won on the same track. Just kind of, not too many years apart, 6 years apart. So it was kind of a fun thing to be able to do as a kid. It was a big deal for me.
Was there any other kind of sports or activities that you were doing when you were, coming up?
Sports were really big in that small town, especially football. We had a football team. Our mascot was called the Saukee Indians, and we had a coach that went on to the NFL. His name was Don Pollard, Deke Pollard, and from 1966 through 71, the team was undefeated, the football team. And I think for 6 of those seasons, they were not scored on 1 point. So, but I was never involved in high school sports. I didn't play baseball, football, or basketball. I mean, as a kid, I played it, in the backyard and sandlot stuff. But uh, I was totally focused on auto racing. I mean, that was what I was all about.
It seems like the people, and I've interviewed a large swath of people from different levels of life. And the people who are the most successful are the guys like you who find a passion at an early age and then just pursue that for their entire life. It's kind of unwavering. They're not jumping all over the place from this to this like a checkerboard.
I think by the time I was in the 8th grade, I knew in my mind, this is, I wanted to do this. I didn't know whether it would happen. I didn't know if I'd be successful at it. I mean, it's an unknown, but I knew that this is what I wanted to pursue. I was hell bent to pursue it. And those people around me knew that. I mean, people recognized it, family members, my mother, and and friends, and just everybody knew that that's what I was interested in, and that was my total focus. I mean, just total focus. I think I read everything I could get my hands on locally in the library at the school and at high school, and then the local library, and we had a local grocer, and he got National Speed Sport news. He was a big sprint car fan, and he knew I was a fan, and he would save those National Speed Sport newses for me. I didn't have enough money for a subscription, and he would give them to me every week. And I would just read those things, page one to the back page. I would read everything I could read. And that was very helpful to me when I finally got to Indianapolis, because I didn't have an in. I didn't know anybody. I didn't, but I had this knowledge of who was who and what was what, and, what shops maybe were in Indianapolis. And, it kind of served as a roadmap once I got here, just having had this passion and really, you know, soaked all this stuff up as much as I could anyway. Anytime something was on TV, I wanted to watch it. And, uh, whether it was a race on ABC Wide World of Sports or some other kind of programming for, any kind of motorsports, really. I wanted to watch it. If Mario Andretti was on, there was a TV show called It Takes a Thief with Robert Wagner, and, he had a cameo on there. And I wanted to make sure I watched that. And, I was totally engrossed in all of this back then.
Okay. So what was the moment that you, like you said, that you really started to enjoy the building stuff and the mechanical side of it? But what was the moment that, like, the aha moment in your brain that said, I'm not going to be a racer, I want to be on the other side?
Well, in racing karts, although I got to race all over the country, I was very fortunate, California to Florida and everywhere in between, it seemed like. I really enjoyed karting. I never was worth a damn, to be honest with you. I mean, I think one of the best finishes I ever had was almost next to the last year that I raced, and I finished third in the Yamaha class in Ocala, Florida, in a street race, and I thought I won the Indy 500. At the time, I was in my late 40s. That was a big accomplishment for me, but I didn't think I was ever that great of a driver. I didn't win any national championships or anything like that. I did get to race on the big track at Daytona a couple of times. I did Quincy in the Park quite a few times, Rock Island Grand Prix, and all of the PKA street races, the Professional Karting Association street races, Macomb and Carthage and Galesburg, and I don't know, all over the place. And then did Shifter 2000 series out in California, and I don't know, drove M8s and Margays primarily as far as chassis were concerned. But I always knew I was better at the mechanics side of it than I was at the driving side of it. I mean, it's tough to convince yourself you're not good at something, especially when you want to be good at it. But I wasn't a great driver, but I had a good time. I really enjoyed doing it.
Okay. And that seems to have carried through your entire life.
Right. I
So
mean, I honestly, to go back and answer your question, I knew at an early age, like even when I was a teenager, that, as bad as I wanted to be an Indy 500 driver, that probably was never going to happen. So, I dreamed of running USAC midgets and sprint cars and all of that. That the go-karts never transpired into any of that. So, but the mechanical side, it did. So I was very fortunate in that respect.
So how did you start your journey into working in a professional environment? How did
Well,
that
the
present
first
itself?
Indy 500 I saw, the first time I came over here by myself was 1970, and I had sent off and got a single ticket for $13 for Tower Terrace Extension for the 1970 Indy 500. Uh, there used to be a short track in Springfield called Little Springfield, or Shahanes, they called it. And it was a really famous midget sprint car track. A lot of Indy guys ran there. USAC came through there and whatnot. And so there was a big fan club in Springfield. And every year they would have this chartered bus junket for pole day. And for $5, you could get a reservation on this bus, go to Springfield, get on this bus in the wee hours. It would go to Indianapolis, drop you off. You'd spend the day, pole day at the speedway, and then at 6 o'clock you had to be on the bus and it'd bring you back to Springfield. So my mom let me go on that bus trip for pole day in 70. and it was fabulous. And anyway, I bought a ticket for the 500, mailed off and got a ticket, and she let me go back for the race, and I went by myself. She took me to Springfield. I got on a regular bus. I think it was a Trailways to Indianapolis, and got off the bus downtown, got a cab out to the Speedway the night before the race, stayed up all night and hung out with all these, wild people on Georgetown Road, and then went to the race. And the next day when the race was over, went back downtown, got on the bus and went back home to Illinois. But, that was the first time over here by myself. And after having experienced both pole day and the 570, if I wasn't hooked by then, now I'm really hooked. And,
Well, just a
I'm
second.
getting ready to graduate high school. So I knew where I wanted to go.
So you went out with the people and hung out all night. Did you party crazy with everybody?
No, I was only 17 years old, so no, but I witnessed it and walked Georgetown Road and stayed up all night. And, I was just a kid from a small farm town. So it was kind of like an eye opener for me, and I was anxious for that aerial bomb to go off at 5 a.m. for them to open the gate and go inside and find my seat and, you know, wander around outside the fence gasoline alley and watch everything that was going on and the cars getting pushed out. And, it was a really wonderful experience. Had a great time.
Yeah, truly there for the racing. Truly.
Right.
Yeah. But so did you know that you wanted to do your work in somehow in this field and you were leaning towards being a mechanic or the mechanical side of the not being a racer? Having a little trouble
Well, I
getting the
knew I
sentence
wanted
out.
to work for the bottom line is I knew I wanted to go to work for an IndyCar team. And, I had no idea which team. I mean, the big team back then was Vels Parnelli Jones. They just won the Indy 500 and they were on top of the world, and George Bignotti and everything that went with that. And they were well funded. And, then there were all these other teams and operations. But I had no idea that I would end up going to work for Vels Parnelli Jones. Just it's the way things worked out and fate. And it's kind of crazy.
Well, how the heck did that happen? Like, you didn't have connections?
No, I had none. So in 71, early 71, I came back over here. I'm out of high school, and I was working at a local grocery store. And so I came over here, and I decided I'd come to Indianapolis for a week and look for a job, even though I already had a job in this small town. So I had enough money saved up that back then, I think the Speedway Motel was $12 a night or something, which I thought was a lot of money. But anyway, I came over and I had about enough money to come over for a week. And so I had an old Volkswagen Beetle. I drove it over. Where I grew up was about 265 miles west of Indianapolis, and the interstates weren't built yet. And so I came over on old Route 36, which went through my hometown and came straight into the west side of Indianapolis. So I came over here, stayed at the Speedway Motel, and I went out and I just started going to all these different race car shops. I went to Watson's, I went to Grant King's, I went to Paul Brooks at Federal Engineering, I went Bill Finley. I mean, all over town, introducing myself. Here I am, this 18-year-old kid. I'm looking for a job, and of course nobody's hiring, or they weren't hiring, some kid 18 years old. And anyway, I went all over. I wanted to stay here so bad that I went over to the Speedway, and Clarence Cagle was the superintendent of grounds back then for Mr. Hallman, and Clarence Cagle was an iconic figure at the Speedway. And I went over with him and got a meeting and to see if I could get on the grounds crew at the Speedway. I wanted to stay here. And he wasn't hiring, but he sent me over to Mr. Holman's Coca-Cola plant down there on 25th Street in Georgetown. And I went down there and put an application in. I just wanted to stay here. I wanted to stay in Indy and keep working it. I wanted to be around racing. I had enough confidence that I thought eventually, I'll get in somewhere. But anyway, I was here a week, and I couldn't find anything. So I went home over that weekend. And while I was here staying at the Speedway Motel, I'd go in the restaurant every morning, get some breakfast. And there was a woman, an elderly woman. I say elderly, she's probably about my mom's age at the time. who worked at the Speedway Motel, and she was kind of like Mr. Holman's secretary, or she had some kind of role there in administration. And her name was Rosemary Ensley. She's no longer with us, but she had stopped me a couple of mornings in the lobby and was, conversant. Well, good morning. How are you? And what brings you to Indianapolis? And I was very candid, 18-year-old kid. I just said, well, I'm here looking for a job with an IndyCar team. And she listened to me. And I think I had a couple of encounters with her during the nights that I stayed there. And so I went home, and over the weekend and that Monday morning, the phone rang in my mom's kitchen, and my mom answered it, and it was for me. And well, it was this lady, Rosemary Ensley from the Speedway Motel. And anyway, she asked me if I remembered, and of course I certainly did. And she said, George Bignotti comes in for breakfast every morning, and I had a conversation with him this morning, and he's looking to hire somebody. And I think if you could get back over here this afternoon, you might have a job. And I couldn't believe it. Vels Parnelli Jones, George Bignotti. I mean, well, my mom had left the house and went to work. She was the county health nurse for the county I grew up in, and her office was in the courthouse. And I'm supposed to go to work at the grocery store. And so, I went straight to her office and asked my mom if I could borrow $20 for gas money. And she wanted to know why. And I told her I wasn't going to work. I was going back to Indianapolis. I might have a shot at getting this job. And I think she thought I was absolutely out of my mind, but she gave me $20, probably didn't have the $20 really to give me, but nonetheless gave me the $20. And I had packed a little suitcase. I got in my Volkswagen, drove straight back to Indianapolis, got over here something, I don't know, like 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Went straight to Vels Parnelli Jones, walked in the front door. There's Jimmy Dillamarter, John Caples, Bignotti. There's the Johnny Lightning and Samsonite cars. And I went up to George. I walked up to him, introduced myself, and he kind of gave me a little interview, and he hired me on the spot, and asked me if I had a place to stay, and I didn't. And he wrote this address down, and he said, go see this lady out in Speedway. And I did. And the rest is history.
Holy cow. Like, I think that raised my my heart rate a little as I was listening to
Now,
that.
I tell this story to people and everybody, and then people that know me, and when we're around people that don't know me, and they say, you got to tell them this story. Well, it's a true story. Rosemary Ensley was a wonderful person. The irony of this is, Dan, is when I was here going around to all these different shops looking for a job, I had went down to 15th Street to Vels Parnelli Jones, and I walked in the door, and I could see everybody in there in the cars, and I was so intimidated I turned around and left that week that I was there. I thought, there's no way. There's not, I'm way out of my league here. And then lo and behold, I come back, a week later, and I'm hired by him. So, and, George told me what, the salary was, and wrote this lady's name down. And I drove out to Speedway after that, and to this little bungalow on 13th Street. The irony of it is I live about a block from that bungalow now, and knocked on this lady's door, nice little house. And this grandmother sort of figure came to the door, and she knew I was coming, and she took me downstairs in her basement, and she had her basement set up like kind of like an army barracks. There were about, I think, 6 or 7 beds down there and armoires, and there was a little kitchenette, and there was a bathroom with a shower. And uh, she housed all these race car people that came through town, all these sprint car drivers that were back here running, and hopefuls that, wanted to go to Indy, and all that sort of thing. And she told me it was $25 a month. And I think I had Bill Simpson as my roommate, and Jack Ford, who was working, he was a mechanic for Patrick Racing. And, there was just different people down there, and they'd come through, these sprint car guys that come through. And I think I lived down there for like at least 2 years in her basement. That wasn't uncommon back then with race car people, and that's just how it kind of started for me.
Okay. What what kind of questions does Bignotti ask you in this interview that's like
Oh, just
completely
basic
just
stuff
off the
like
hip?
where are you from, and how old are you, and what kind of experience do you have in racing, and this and that and one thing and another. And yeah, just not anything super technical. I mean, George, he was a really, I loved George Bignotti. He was a great guy, and he was really good to me the whole time that I was around him. And That was pretty much it. He didn't ask me if I can weld, if I was a machinist or anything like that. You know, he took a chance on me, and the next thing I know, I'm working under Jimmy Dillamarter, who became a lifelong friend, and I'm on Al Unser Sr.'s car, the Johnny Lightning Special.
Well,
So
I imagine this is do you remember the feeling of when he said, "Yeah, we'll give you a shot and we'll give you a job"? I mean, how the that would
it
that's like
was
winning the
unbelievable. I
lottery.
mean, you can't imagine. I mean, I was euphoric, and I think one of the first things I did that evening was call my mom, and I think they, I think probably she thought, well, he's like not telling me the truth. I mean, this is a little hard to believe, but it was absolute. It was for real, and it was just like there was divine intervention or something. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, for me, and for that door to be opened, and the way it was opened and everything, it was just kind of crazy.
Yeah, what a
So,
cool story. Okay, you show up to work day one. What is your job? Like you don't even necessarily know exactly what you got hired to do.
well, Vels Parnelli Jones back then had two shops. They had a shop out 190th Street in Hawthorne, California, where we built the new cars, and they had fabricators, Joe Fukushima, and different people out there. And then Big Knotty in the building down there on 15th Street. There was Jimmy Dillamarter and John Caples, myself, Charlie Tabucci, the famous engine builder, and Lee Petrobon and Red Oliver. And we were kind of like the Indianapolis-based part of it at that time, and then all these other, handful of guys were out in California. Uh, so I mean, we're running the Johnny Lightning car with Al Unser, and Joe Leonard's driving the Samsonite car, and you know, just I was under the guidance of Jimmy Dillamarter, and he taught me a lot. I used to tease him and John Caples. They're both gone now, but I say, man, you guys taught me a lot of good habits and a lot of bad ones. But they were two really wonderful guys. I mean, they've been around racing. They were around racing their whole lives. I mean, Jimmy went to work for Big Knotty in I think '66, and he was on Graham Hill's winning car. Obviously, both of Al Unser's winners, and then he ran the F1 team when Mario uh, ran F1 for VPJ. Jimmy was the team manager and moved to England. And Caples, he grew up in Albuquerque racing with Bobby and Al, and came here as a driver. But he was also a very capable fabricator, machinist. He was a fabulous welder, and I mean, just talent in spades. And he came back here and ran USAC sprint cars. I think obviously his goal was Indianapolis, and that never happened. But he became a really noted chief mechanic, and then later on the head of CART and the head of USAC. You know, uh, in the latter part of his career, Jim Dillamarter stayed with Velen Parnelli almost up until his death about a year ago. But he was there. He went to work for Velen Parnelli in '68, and he was there until they shut the office down out there, shut everything down a couple of years ago. But
Well,
those guys were incredibly beneficial. Charlie Tabucci, he was an engine builder. He'd been a childhood friend of Big Knotty's. These guys, both those guys were, hot rodders, midget guys out of San Francisco, and in their youth, and in their, when they were younger. And then Lee Petrobon, he'd grown up near Mario in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Red Oliver was a black gentleman who was from Indianapolis, who had been a driver in the famed Golden Glory series for black drivers back in the '30s, and later on became, worked for the post office, and he was retired, and he kind of like kept everything in order in the shop. And it was just a wonderful group. It was just really a small group running these two cars.
what were your responsibilities?
It's like a chassis man under Jimmy Dillamarter. So Charlie Tabucci and Larry Slutter did all the engines. Caples did all the gearboxes. Plus, he was the co-chief on the Joe Leonard Samsonite car. And I helped Jimmy and George whatever they needed. I bolted engines on and off the dyno down there, and helped prepare the car, and kept everything clean, washed a lot of parts, and drove transported cars sometimes, not with a big transporter, but with a coffin trailer in the truck. And, I was entrusted with a lot of responsibility for an 18-year-old kid. I'm hauling an Indy car by myself cross country, back and forth to California and stuff like that. I mean, it was an incredible experience.
Yeah. And that is a lot of responsibility. So was every day just like living a dream, or were there challenges also that were thrown at you that were, pretty difficult and maybe had to overcome?
Well, I mean, it was like living the dream. I mean, then the super team came along when we brought on Mario in 72, and the team almost overnight morphed or quadrupled in size to 40 some team members. And we built those VPJ cars, the VPJ1 with a dihedral wing. And we, we left Indianapolis that winter and everybody moved to California, and we built those cars out there and tested it in Ontario. And now the team was really big, and now we got 3 cars, 3 drivers, and the cars didn't work that well in the beginning. And you went into work at 8 o'clock in the morning. You didn't know when or if you were going home. And, it was a real thrash. 72 was a real hard season. I mean, to be with that team. We won 3 races with Joe Leonard. We finished second at Indy with Al and third with Joe, and then Mario finished ninth. But, we went through a lot of fits and starts with those cars, a lot of modification, a lot of blowing motors. Just, it was really hard.
Mm. And then
Hard.
the dihedral wing idea didn't really pan out.
We had, with Mario coming there and him having done some one-off races with Lotus in Formula One, and then had driven the Lotus 64 to Indianapolis before he crashed in practice and got burnt. He was a big believer in Maurice Felipe, who had been Colin Chapman's head designer. Well, they brought him to Vels Parnelli Jones along with John Baldwin, his assistant, and Maurice designed that first dihedral wing car. And they were terrible right out of the box the first time we tested the first one at Ontario. And we pretty much knew right away that we were going to have to add a rear wing, a regular rear wing and front wings, and that these dihedrals weren't going to cut it. We continued to test with those configurations out at Ontario. It was a mad thrash to finish those cars. The first time we ran them was at Trenton in April. We ran the first race at Phoenix that year, and we used the year-old Colts. We had converted them to offies, and they had rear wings, front wings, and side-mounted radiators. They were highly modified from the way they looked in 71. And anyway, we ran them at Phoenix, and then we took the dihedral wings for the first outing to Trenton, and we ran all the wings on those cars. I mean, the front wings, the rear wings, the dihedrals, and every other little aero device. I forget how many different little wings were on the car. Somebody counted them up one time. There was like 22, I think, aero devices. But we did okay at Trenton. We didn't win. And then we went to Indianapolis for the month of May, and we were doggedly slow. Bobby Unser and the new Roman Slobodinsky designed Eagle of Dan's he was running 192 miles an hour, and we were 10 miles an hour slower. I think for a long time, Al, for the first week we were stuck at 182 or something, 183. And it was, I mean, they had a lot of money from Firestone, and they had Brown Williamson Tobacco with Viceroy and Samsonite and Olympia Beer and Minolta Camera, all these big sponsors. And, and here we were the super team with the past 2 Indy 500 winners and the California 500 winner, and we can't get up to speed. So I think it was about after the first week of practice, the conversation started about taking the dihedrals off, and an argument more or less ensued between the powers to be, Vel and Parnelli and Maurice, moreover, Maurice Felipe and Bignotti. And Bignotti was all for taking the things off and seeing what would happen. And George prevailed, and we took the dihedrals off. They housed the engine oil coolers. That presented a problem. Now, where are we going to put those? And we kind of more or less almost flush mounted them against the tub, and then had to fabricate aluminum fairings for those, and just a lot of work. But we picked up right off the bat 5 miles an hour in speed. So The dihedrals never went back on the cars ever again. That was it. That was the end of the dihedral experiment. And we qualified okay. Al didn't. We didn't qualify. Al had. I think we lost a motor on pole day weekend, and we ended up not qualifying the second weekend. But we finished second with Al, as I said, third with Joe Leonard, and then Mario would have probably had a top. We'd had all three in the top five, but as I recall, Mario ran out of fuel down in turn 3 on the last lap of the 500 and ended up getting past. He finished ninth, but we still had all three cars in the top 10. But nonetheless, those cars were an ongoing experiment in development, and a lot of blown motors, a lot of burnt pistons, and just and then finally Joe Leonard came through with a win at first win, I think, was at Michigan, and then we went. Pocono got rained out, and we had to go back, and then he won at Pocono, and then he won the second Milwaukee race in '72. Mario and Al didn't have any wins for us in '72 at all.
And so let's kind of move forward just a little bit to get to your Indy 500, to when you did win. And what was different about that year? You know, what was there a feeling from springtime when we start training, or going into it, that something was different? Was there a feeling in the air?
Well, when you got a fast car and when you're going to run up front. I mean, we had the drivers. I mean, Al Unser Sr., obviously, and Gordy Johncock. You gave those guys the car, they're going to be up front. You got a good chance of winning. Mario, I mean, all of them, to be honest with you, Joe Leonard, everybody. But, it's a big boost of confidence when you're out there every day for practice and you're the fastest, during the month of May every day or close to it, or wherever you go and unload, you're going to start up front and you got a good shot at winning. So it just depends. I mean, if you got a good car, you got a good car. It's like when Al won in '71, Al said, we didn't have the best car with the '71 Colt. The McLaren had the best car with the M16. And Al used to put it in real simple terms. He said, Revson had the car, I had the experience. And that's how he felt that, he was able to pull through and prevail and win the '71 500 just based on experience. But Revson definitely, McLaren had the car. I mean, the writing was on the wall during the month of May at Indianapolis that car, employing the engine as a stress member, running a rear wing, front wings, that wedge shape, and everything that was involved in the M16 McLaren was, it was a groundbreaker. And then, after that, everybody was just chasing that design. That by the time we got to Ontario, by the time we got to Phoenix into '71, if you look at all the Indy cars, they all had rear wings, they all had front wings, they all kind of tried to change the look of their cars to more or less resemble, what McLaren had, because that was the hot setup.
How do you contrast the feeling of winning your first go-kart race, being offered that job, and winning at the Indy 500 on part of a team?
Well, they're close, but it's a totally different thing. I mean, to be in victory lane with an Indy car anywhere, Ontario, which I was, Phoenix, Trenton, different places, and it's a unique experience. Uh, you don't get tired of winning, I can tell you that. It's it's when you don't win that you could have. I mean, we came close so many times at all these different racetracks. You'd be running up front, leading the race, and it looked like it was a sure thing you're going to win, and then you burn a piston or something and you're out. Um, you kind of get used to it in a way, but yet you never get used to it. Um, Winning though is I'm one of those few people that got to go to victory lane with an Indy car. It's a unique experience. I mean, your work has paid off. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it's just it was a big deal.
Yeah, can only imagine. So, and how long did your career in IndyCar span?
I stuck around until '75, And then I got out of it full time, and my life took a different career path. And um, but I kept my fingers in it. I was a weekend warrior for different people, and um, stayed in tune with the sport and stayed in touch with a lot of people in the sport. I don't think there's one person left in IndyCar today from my era. Up until a couple of years ago, there was, but I think everybody's aged out. So I was really young when I got in it. I was only 18. So, people that were in it in my era, for the most part, they were a little bit older than me, or a lot older than me, and they're all out of the sport, and many of them are deceased. I was looking at a qualifying picture the other day. Jagger Jones was with me out at the shop, and there's a picture on a credenza in my office of the 72 qualifying picture of Al and the crew, and there's only myself and Jim Cook left alive that are in that picture from 1972. Jim Cook was our PR guy. He was the guy that found all the big sponsors, Topper Toys, Johnny Lightning, Viceroy, and so forth. And he's still with us, and he lives over in Ohio. His son is John Cook, the PGA golfer, and they own a golf course over there called Cook's Crossing. But I think we're the last two.
He was your Ralph Hansen, if you will.
He was the Ralph Hansen of the day. He was the Ralph Hansen of the day. Jim Cook I think he was a native of the Dayton era and had gone to Ohio State and went to work for Firestone, ended up with their race tire division. Bill McCreary, back then, headed up Firestone race tire division. Jim Cook was under him. And of course, Parnelli was always a big fixture with Firestone. And then Vels Parnelli Jones Racing was a huge, biggest Firestone team, funded team. And Jim left Firestone and set up Jim Cook and Associates out in Torrance. And that's what he did. He was a promoter and a sponsor hunter and all of that, and a very successful one. Same thing that Ralph Hansen has done with his life.
Okay, so you have a dream, you fulfill the dream, you go all the way to the top, and a few years later, you're like, what pulled you to the next direction, and what was the thirst that it seems like I would have just probably stayed right where I was, but you just have this drive that keeps going. What was the next step?
I don't know. I did. I wanted to go to college, and a lot of people in my family had been in the military, and I'd had a draft card. I had a high number, didn't get drafted. My Uncle John had been in the Marine Corps. My father was a World War II veteran. He was with Patton's Third Army. He was a combat engineer. And I got out of IndyCar racing. I enlisted in the Marine Corps, went in the Marine Corps for 6 years. And when I got out, I used the GI Bill, went to college, graduated, and went to work in real estate in New York City. I mean, something totally 180 degrees away from IndyCar racing. But that was the direction my life took.
It was did you find satisfaction and thrill in real estate as well? I mean, just when you're in something and you're doing it, it seems like you can just drive that passion to whatever you're putting it toward.
I was a good salesperson. I credit that to personality, and then the experience I had in IndyCar racing. Working for that IndyCar team, being around, you had to know Jimmy Dillamarter and John Caples and their personalities, and they were very outgoing people, and just interesting guys, and put themselves out there. That's why their careers went the way it did. To the hype. I mean, John Caples ended up running USAC, and then later on CART. I forget which one he did first. And Jim Dillamarter ended up running, overseeing pretty much all of the Vels Parnelli Jones land company holdings, all the real estate developments and everything. And I think some of that rubbed off on me. And it allowed me to become a really good salesperson. And that's when I started in New York City in real estate. That's what I did. And I was I was really successful at it. And I did that for a long time.
Were there any moments in real estate that were, up there on par with the other wins that you had, those like thrilling, just victorious moments?
Nothing really on par with that. I mean, it's really nice to have a huge sale, in New York City, real estate's not cheap. And the one company I was with, I was voted sales manager of the year in 1985 for New York City. And, that was a high point. And I sold a lot of property. They put up a new condo building, and I'd sell 40 units in a building or something in a short period of time. I was, kind of blessed in that respect. I had the gift of gab. People, they trusted me, believed in me, and, I was able to close deals and be successful at it.
Yep. And then and so then we move forward to Vintage Indy and leaving real estate, which I'm assuming because you were back in Indianapolis, not Vintage Indy. First,
Well, we retired, and the way Vintage Indy started, if I may tell the story, was just absolutely by happenstance, or however you say it. I'd been in the Marine Corps, and I had a nephew that went in the Marine Corps. A bunch of us family members were going out to San Diego for his boot camp graduation, and Philippe de L'Espinay and some others knew I was coming out, and Dan Gurney, and hadn't been down to AAR, All American Racers, in 40 years, and got invited down, my wife and I, to go have lunch and see Dan's collection of cars. They'd restored some Eagles by then in the Toyota GTP car, and they had a room at AAR, and so we went down and had lunch and hung out the better part of the day. And we're standing around in that room where these vintage cars were that were restored. And this was in 2016, the year of the 100th running of the Indy 500. And somebody said, "Hey, we're taking the Olsonite Eagle back for the HRE event the museum's doing at the Speedway. Why don't you come and help?" And so I said, okay. So I came back for that event, race weekend, and I think they had 103 vintage Indy cars there, and it was just a major eye opener. I helped them run the Olsonite Eagle. I helped them run Jack Brabham's Cooper Climax, and also ended up helping them run Barry Briggs's Lightning, which had been Larry Rice's rookie year car. And just I really enjoyed that weekend, and it was an eye opener with all these cars and people, and where did all these cars come from? And they were keeping the cars over, a couple of these guys, for SVRA at the Speedway, which was going to be another event there a couple of weeks after the Indy 500. And they said, "Would you be interested in coming back and help us run these three cars?" I said, "Sure." So I came back for the SVRA event, and we ran the three cars again. And the light bulb kind of went off at some point, and I'm wondering, who organizes this? And it seems like there's a lot of restored vintage Indy cars out there, and I did some research and discovered that there was no organization that was really, involved in any of this, organizing it, and there was no registry for these cars. So initially, I came up with the idea of creating a registry to track down, get in contact with the current owners of these cars, the history, the provenance, the whole thing, and so in 2017, launched the Vintage Indy Registry out at Phoenix at the IndyCar race. Um, and it took off immediately. And then within a year, I was getting phone calls from promoters at Road America in St. Louis. "Can you bring vintage Indy cars here with IndyCar?" And, my response was, "Well, I don't really do that. This is just a registry of information, a repository, if you will." And anyway, Chris Blair, who's still the president down at WWT Raceway in Madison, Illinois, St. Louis Gateway, they used to call it, got me to come for a meeting. And when I walked out of that meeting, we had booked our first on-track event, and that was with IndyCar in 2018. And this year will be our 7th year going back there. And we have six major events this year, and a lot of smaller things that we're involved in. Everything from supplying cars for Rev over at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway the PRI show, and just all kinds of things. And that's kind of how it began, and that's how it got where it's at today. And it's like a second lease on life for me, and I'm deep into it.
yeah, and literally a second lease on life for you.
Right,
You did have a little bit
right.
of problem with some heart issues that almost took you out.
Yeah, I had a massive heart attack here in Indianapolis. It'll be 3 years in August, and fortunately, it was in the right place, the right time. They got me to Methodist, got me upstairs, and put 3 stents in me, and went through cardiac rehab and did really well. And then a year and a half later, ended up having to have double heart bypass surgery back here at Methodist. So I feel really, blessed to still be here, and try to get the most out of every day.
What are the people, kind of what's the group of people that get a vintage Indy car, one of these race cars, and have them restored? And do a lot of them have them restored by other people, or do they have a hand in it themselves?
It's kind of a mixed bag. Some people do their own restorations. They're capable of that. Many, have the cars restored by other people. I mean, there's some notables that have been around for a few years restoring cars. Walter Goodwin, Rick Duman, Don Hovel, uh, you name it. I mean, and then there's a lot of individuals that do their own thing, but uh, it's an industry in itself. There's more cars now than ever, and there's a lot in the pipeline. People are still looking for certain cars that haven't been found, that have a great history that, people don't know where they're at. They're still being found. I've had the good fortune of finding 2 barn finds in my life, both Indy cars. One was a Johnny Lightning car on a 140-acre fruit tree farm out in Reedley, and then a couple of years ago, I found the Bill Finley. Bill Finley was a famous chief mechanic, and for the car owner Tassie Vadas, he had built this USAC championship dirt car that Johnny Parsons drove, that John put on the pole at the Hoosier 100 2 years in a row. And I found that in a storage container down in Florida. And both those cars have been brought back to life. One's in Ray Skillman's collection, and the other's in the Museum of American Speed out in Lincoln, Nebraska. So it's there's a lot going on in this world of vintage motorsports. I am told right now that all over the world, the biggest growth form in motorsports, the biggest area of growth in motorsports is anything vintage, not necessarily vintage Indy cars, but vintage motorsports is huge right now.
And so I've been to your facility at Vintage Indy, and you guys have a lot of work going on in there. At what point did that come to life, where you started holding the cars and having people working on them in your own facility?
Well, Rick Duman had been helping a guy here in Indianapolis do some restoration work. Rick Duman is the son of Ronnie Duman, the former 500 driver. Ronnie Duman lost his life at Milwaukee in '68, a week after finishing in the top 5 at Indianapolis in 1968. Rick himself was a noted Indy 500 chief mechanic, a George Bignotti Award winner, Clint Bronner Award winner at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And he'd been a former USAC midget driver. And so uh, he had gravitated towards, vintage restoration, was working with a guy here in town, and then decided to go out on his own. And we knew one another, and uh, he rented space out in John Force's Industrial Park in Brownsburg, and got going out there. And I was still had a go-kart back then, and I was running my nephew and other people in it. And so I ended up, keeping it out there, and one thing led to another. And Rick ran out of space with the space he had. So the space available next door became available next door. And so he rented that from John Force, and John let him break through the wall. And then I ran out of space with those 2 spaces, and a third space came up when Graham Rahal moved out for a bigger space. And Rick got a hold of me and said, "Hey, this third space is coming up. Do you want to throw in with me?" And I said, "Sure." And Vintage Indy was, we'd been going, I don't know, a couple, 3 years by then, just doing the events and the registry. So I threw in with him, and one thing led to another. And we now have, I think I counted 30 cars out there this morning. Most all of them are Indy cars. We do have a 962 Porsche that ran at Le Mans. We've got an F5000 car and an F2 car, but everything else is Indy car. And it's a full-blown vintage Indy car restoration shop. Rick does track services. We do storage. The one room is kind of like, almost, I guess you could call it a museum. We've got about 15 cars in there that are fully restored running cars that do different events. And there's a couple of Pebble Beach winners mixed in that room. And uh, that's, a lot of artwork on the walls, a lot of memorabilia, both Rick's and mine. And just kind of a cool place to go in every day. It's one of those places you walk in, you sit down, and you say to yourself, how the hell did this happen?
What kind of educational initiatives does Vintage Indy support, and why are they important to you?
Well, let's see. We do everything from sponsor uh, kids and go-karts. Go-karting's still important to me. We sponsor in the Margay Ignite series, which is a wonderful series. Margay Karts out of St. Louis is America's oldest racing kart chassis manufacturer. On its own, it's got a third generation owner in Keith Freber. And Vintage Indy sponsors the Margay Ignite rookie class. We also sponsor a driver in that class by the name of J.P. Borey from Northern Illinois up in the Chicagoland area. And J.P., he's a winning driver. He's won a lot of races, and he's leading in the championship for the points this year. And we also are on Jimmy Jones's kart in the Margay Ignite series in a different class. Jimmy is the grandson of Parnelli. And I don't know, we're engaged in all kinds of things like that. We do different events out at the shop. And uh, to me, the aspect of getting everything motorsports across to youth in America is really important. And we host a lot of different things out at the shop to try to encourage the younger generation to get interested in motorsports in general, but moreover in the vintage aspect of it, because the median age of people that are involved in vintage Indy, let's say, it's an older person. It's somebody that's been able to acquire some wealth in life and be able to afford this. It's not an inexpensive hobby to have. But everybody that's involved in vintage Indy, all the car owners and people associated with it, we all see and know that it's critical that we get today's youth involved in this and get them interested in it. We have right now out at the shop, we've got a young man, Vico Pregular from Kansas City, and he's our intern. He's 19. I met him through Rudy Francic in karting, and Vico was into vintage karts, restoring vintage karts and racing vintage karts, and he was winning a lot of races in vintage kart racing. And anyway, he ended up at Purdue last year as a freshman engineering student, and he reached out to me, over the winter and said he was looking for something this summer in motorsports to do and wanted to stay in Indianapolis, wanted to stay in Indiana. So I got him to come in. Rick interviewed him. Rick gave him a position for the summer, and it's really worked out well. And it's just a classic example. You got to bring youth into this, and we need young blood in here. We need young interest in it. And it's something we have to do in order to keep it going. And Indianapolis and IndyCar racing is all about the history. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway is steeped in it. And it's imperative that, we get youth interested in it. And when the museum reopens after the $90 million redo next spring, I mean, there's going to be a big focus on youth and STEM programs and all that sort of thing. It's critical.
Well, what advice would you give to somebody who's, younger and looking to get into racing as a career?
Well, follow your passion. Graham Rahal does a wonderful Cars and Coffee during the nice months of the year and on Saturday mornings out there, and it just gets an inordinate number of people. And I usually go out to the shop on those Saturday mornings and open an overhead door. We'll roll a car out, and of course, it draws a lot of people. And our parking lot's full of people there for Cars and Coffee with all kinds of cars. And there's a lot of youth involved in that. I mean, really young kids and then teenagers, and they all come by and look at the car, and they always have a lot of questions. And every now and then I'll bring somebody in the shop and just give them a tour if I note that they're really interested. And that's a big question they all ask if their parents are with them. How does my son or how does my daughter get involved in this? And you have to follow your passion. There's more opportunity in motorsports today than probably ever in history. And, you have to put yourself out there is what I tell people. You have to put yourself out there. You're going to get the door slammed in your face. You're going to be told no probably 100 times before you're told yes. It's just like everything else in life. And, if you really want to do it, you need to pursue it and give it a shot. Give it your best shot. Don't give it some half-baked shot. You have to really put yourself out there and go and meet people and introduce yourself, and you know hopefully you get a door open for you like I did.
How do you hope to be remembered in the racing community, and what kind of a legacy do you think that you're going to be leaving behind? Because you're
Oh,
one of the men too. You're one of the people.
uh, I don't know. I don't really think about that. I'm a member of the Indy 500 old timers, and I feel really fortunate to be in that group and to still be around, still be enjoying this and sharing this with people. I think, we like to say that we bring the history when we go out with Vintage Indy to an IndyCar race. We're getting ready to go to Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix. No matter where we go, we bring the history, and I think the history is critical. And if I could just be remembered for helping bring the history, I mean, I got to live it. And on this second lease in life that I've gotten with Vintage Indy and all that I'm doing now, it's like icing on the cake. I think it's really important to, put it out there and let people enjoy it, and perhaps pave a way for somebody else to find their way into it the same way that I was, fortunate enough to get to do.
Mm. And upon getting that second lease on life, did it change how you looked at life in general? I hear a lot of people that go through that kind of an experience have a completely different outlook, but you've had so many darn victories throughout your life. How did that change your perspective?
Well, I stayed conscious during the heart attack. And I actually, my wife had, place of mind to call 911. I was kind of saying, well, let's see, I don't know. I don't feel so hot, but I think I'll get dressed just in case we need to go to the emergency room. And she took a second look at me and said, I'm calling 911. And I said, well, I'll slip my shoes on. We'll walk. We were in a hotel here in Indianapolis. We were in a Marriott. So I said, I'll go get on the elevator. We'll go down the lobby and wait for the ambulance. So I did. And when they got there, they took one look at me, got me on the gurney, and hooked me up. And they said, we're going straight to the ER. And I was conscious the whole time. I mean, I can't say that I was fearful or anything of not making it. I had confidence I'd be okay, especially once I got down there. I got wonderful care, and both times actually. I can't speak highly enough for IU Health. But I've always had really strong conviction. I've always been a believer in myself, and a believer in surviving, and that I'd be okay. And I kind of look at life that way, and I don't think that there's any more emphasis on living life every day now after all that I went through with the heart issue than there was before. I mean, I before I wanted to get as much out of life every day as I could, and I still feel that way. And, I'm 71 years old, and, but I don't think like a 71-year-old. I mean, the body's starting to tell me I am 71, but, you know, my brain's telling me, that I'm still like 25 or something. But still have a lot of enthusiasm, and I look forward to getting up every morning and, having, doing something positive every day.
Mm. Is there anything still on that revised bucket list now that needs to get checked off still? Again, you've accomplished so darn many
Oh,
things.
my bucket list is all motorsport stuff. I've never been to Le Mans. And, I want to go to Le Mans with my wife in the worst way. Jagger may get to race, so Jagger Jones may get to run an LMP2 car over there next year. So it'd be wonderful to go over for that. Uh, I'd like to go to Goodwood. I had a chance to run a car at Festival of Speed a few years ago, the Jack Brabham Cooper Climax, to go over with Philippe Delespine and do that. And then there was a conflict and we couldn't go. But I definitely would love to go to the Festival of Speed and or the Revival, either one of them. Probably more over the Revival than the Festival of Speed. And then I really want to go to Jimmy Clark's. I want to go to the Clark Museum in Scotland and go to his grave. And those are three big things on my bucket list. I've had a wonderful life. I've gotten to do so much. I mean, beyond motorsports. I don't know how all this unfolded. I had enthusiasm as a kid. I probably had a bucket list from age 6. I want to go to Mount Rushmore. I want to go to California. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to go to these historic places. I think I've pretty much gotten to do it all in spades, and I feel very fortunate. But I think it's all about drive. Uh, there's always a way if there's a will. And, if you do the right thing, you put yourself out there, you work hard, you're going to have some accomplishments. You're going to have some satisfaction, I think, when you get to the point where you're near the end of your life.
Is there anything else that you want to share with the audience? Anything about racing, Vintage Indy, or your journey in general?
I have this saying, never surrender. And you just keep pushing forward. Life's not easy sometimes, and one can get really super discouraged. And sometimes things don't go your way, and people around you aren't, necessarily super supportive. But, if you've got strong convictions and a strong will and a desire, just keep pushing forward. You want to get to the front.
How can people find out more about Vintage Indy and follow what you're doing?
VintageIndyRegistry.com. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and X. I try to post almost every day or so on Instagram. There's always something interesting going on with us. We're involved in a lot of people in our orbit, and I'd say Instagram is a great way. And if you go back and look through, 5, 6, 7 years worth of photographs on Instagram, I mean, you'll see some really wonderful things and beautiful cars and just events and cars we've restored and just any number of different things that are associated with us. And it's really a good a textbook for what we're all about.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to share some of your story with me. And my goodness, I've got a ton of footage from like 4 different things now, probably 2.5 hours worth of stuff to sift through. And I don't know how I'm going to cut any of it out because it's all fire.
Well, it's always great seeing you, Dan. I love what you do, and look forward to seeing you back here in Indianapolis or somewhere else down the road at a racetrack or something.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of the Details Podcast. Mike Lashmett's story is a testament to the incredible history and dedication that keep the sport of IndyCar racing alive. It's people like him who ensure that the legacy of the sport endures for future generations. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out Vintage Indy and learn more about how you can experience the history of racing up close and personal. Thanks for watching. It means the world to me from the bottom of my heart. And until next time, stay glossy.